Hello, I'm Gareth, and we're going to be looking now at how to calculate the various fixed overhead variances, the fixed overhead expenditure variance, the fixed overhead volume variance, and then breaking the volume variance down into a fixed overhead efficiency and fixed overhead capacity variance. Well, bear in mind, variances are ultimately looking at the difference between figures we expected to happen, perhaps from our budget, and figures that did happen, so the actual results. So we can see in the example we're going to look at here, we've got budgeted fixed overheads of £50,000, so perhaps that's what we thought our landlord was going to charge us for rent. Rent's a good example of a fixed overhead. Budgeted output, the number of units we thought we were going to make was 10,000 units, and we expected that to take a total of 20,000 labour hours. So that's our budgeted information. We've then got some actual information, what actually happened. So the actual level of output was only 8,000 hours, lower than we were budgeting, and that took a total of 17,000 labour hours. Now you can see that number of labour hours is less than we were budgeting. That's perhaps not surprising, given that we didn't make as many units as we expected, and the actual fixed overheads, the actual amount we spent on our rent, was £52,000. Well, let's start by looking at the fixed overhead expenditure variance, which is literally just looking at the difference between the amount we budgeted for our fixed overhead and the amount we actually spent for our fixed overhead, which is just going to be looking at the difference between the £50,000 and the £52,000. And then the variance is just the difference. Well, the difference here is £2,000, and in fact the expenditure variance is already measured in pounds, so I don't need to adjust that. Is that favourable or adverse? Well, in this case we actually spent more on our fixed overhead than we expected. We spent more on our rent than we expected. That's ultimately going to reduce our profit, so I think that's an adverse variance for the fixed overhead expenditure variance. Well, if the fixed overhead expenditure variance is comparing the budgeted fixed overhead expenditure to the actual level of fixed overhead expenditure, then the volume variance does something quite similar, with the difference that if we're looking at the volume variance, we're now going to compare the budgeted volume to the actual volume, rather than comparing the budgeted cost to the actual cost. One thing to just be a bit careful of is that if they give you both sales and production volume figures, we would generally use production volume, because you can imagine it's what you produce that tends to drive your costs rather than what you sell. So now comparing the budgeted volume to the actual volume, which as a variance or a difference gives me 2,000 as a difference between the 10,000 and the 8,000. Now, one thing to watch for is this time the variance is in units rather than in pounds, so I will need to convert this. And is this a favourable or an adverse variance? Well, the way I think of the volume variances, this is looking at how much I'm getting out of my factory, that factory that we're paying the fixed overhead for. Did we get more or less than expected? Well, we actually got less than we expected out of the factory. That's likely to be bad news for the profits of the business. We've produced less units. That's likely to mean we earn less money. So this is an adverse variance where the actual volume produced is less than we expected. Now that variance is in units, so we now need to convert to that. And the general rule is we always value at standard costs. So whichever variances you're looking at, to be honest, if you have a variance in units or a variance in hours or a variance in kilograms, you might be looking at labour or materials variances, for instance. We always value those non-pound variances at the standard cost. In this case, it would be the standard fixed overhead absorption rate per unit. Now remember, when we value at standards are derived from your budgeted figures. The standards are what we set as an expectation at the beginning of the year. So our standard fixed overhead absorption rate, just working out based on the budgeted figures, would be the £50,000 total expected costs, and per unit, divide by 10,000 units, would be £5 per unit. Basically, I'm just working out an OAR per unit there, which if I apply that £5 per unit to the 2,000 unit variance will convert to a £10,000 variance, and we already know that's an adverse variance. Now that adverse variance on volume, remember that's because ultimately the actual volume produced was less than we expected. Now remember, we can then break this down into two further variances to explain why the volume was lower. So if we start by thinking about the efficiency variance, the fixed overhead efficiency variance, now this is looking at whether our staff worked more efficiently or less efficiently than we expected. Basically, did they work faster or slower than we anticipated? You can imagine if they worked faster than we thought they were going to, they'll probably have produced a higher volume than we expected. If they worked slower than we expected, they'll have produced a lower volume. Now, the way we work out the efficiency variance, and it's actually very similar to the labour efficiency variance that you might be familiar with. So we look at what the actual level of production should have taken them to produce, so how many hours should it have taken, and then look at how many hours it actually did take. So you can see this variance is based on the actual level of production. So it's going to be based on the 8,000 units they actually made. Now when we think about what that should have taken to produce, so how many hours should that have taken, well, should is what we would have expected. Should always take us back to standard, to our expectation. So if we go back to our budgeted figures, according to the budget, 10,000 units should have taken 20,000 hours. So how many hours should each unit have taken? And just make sure you divide your figures the right way. 20,000 hours over 10,000 units. We should have been looking at 2 hours per unit. That's how fast our staff should have been working. That's our standard, our expectation. Now if we expected our staff to take 2 hours per unit and they actually produced 8,000 units in total, that should have taken 16,000 hours. So if they were working exactly as fast as we expected, they'd have taken 16,000 hours. How many hours did they take? What was the actual hours required? Well, they actually took 17,000, didn't they? They took more hours than we were expecting. They must have worked a bit slower than expected. And in fact, if I compare my figures, the 16,000 hours we should expect them to take to the 17,000 hours they did take, that gives me a variance of 1,000. Now that 1,000 is currently measured in hours. They've taken 1,000 hours more than they should have done. They've been slower than expected. And if they've taken more hours, then I'm going to have to pay for those hours. So I think this is an adverse variance. If they're slower than expected, that's going to cost me more. That's going to reduce my profits. Now again, this is a variance in hours, which I therefore need to convert to work it out in pounds. And remember, we tend to value at the standard cost. Now, this is where you've got to be a bit careful. It would be a very easy mistake to make. To go back to the volume variance, remember we'd used a standard cost, that £5. It'd be very easy to grab that same £5, but you've got to be very careful because that £5 was £5 per unit, wasn't it? Remember, the volume variance of 2,000 was a units variance, whereas the efficiency variance we're now looking at, that's a variance in hours. So we actually need to work out a fixed overhead absorption rate per hour. We can't just use the cost per unit, it's a different thing. So although we've already worked out a fixed overhead absorption rate based on the budgeted figures, that £5 is per unit, so we actually now need to work out another fixed overhead absorption rate, still taking the same cost of £50,000, but if we want a rate per hour, we need to divide by the budgeted hours. Remember, for your standards, you always use your budgeted figures. So it's £2.50 per hour, which you can see kind of makes sense because if it's £5 per unit, and we already know that there's 2 hours required to make each unit, that does translate to £2.50 per hour, doesn't it? You just got to make sure you're using the right fixed overhead absorption rate for each variance. So using the £2.50 per hour to value the hours variance gives me £2,500, and we already know that's an adverse variance, so the fact that our staff are working slower than expected has led to that much of the volume variance. And so finally, the capacity variance. Well, if the fixed overhead efficiency variance is looking at how fast your staff are working, the fixed overhead capacity variance looks at how long they're working for, on the basis that if they work longer hours, they should be able to produce more units and lead to a higher volume. So the capacity variance, we're just going to compare the budgeted number of hours we thought they were going to work to the actual number of hours they did work. So comparing the 20,000 hours we thought they were going to need to the 17,000 hours they did work. Now actually you can see immediately they've worked fewer hours than expected, so actually that's likely to lead to a reduction in the volume they can produce. And if I compare those two figures, I get 3,000 as my variance. Now at the moment that's measured in hours, and because they've worked fewer hours than budgeted, that's going to lead to a reduction in volume, so that's an adverse variance. And as ever, if you've got a variance that's not already in pounds, so this one's in hours, we need to convert to pounds, and we generally do that at the standard. So in this case, the standard fixed overhead absorption rate, and we want to use the per hour rate because the variance is in hours, and we worked out the per hour rate was £2.50, so don't get confused by the £5 per unit standard cost. And 3,000 hours at £2.50 per hour gives me £7,500 as my overall fixed overhead capacity variance, and we know that's an adverse variance because they worked fewer hours than budgeted. And I can now do my double check, because remember the fixed overhead efficiency and fixed overhead capacity variances should break down the fixed overhead volume variance. And if you combine 7,500 adverse with 2,500 adverse, I think that does indeed give a total of 10,000 adverse. So I can now say that the reduction in volume, remember they only made 8,000 units instead of 10,000 units, that reduction in volume was caused by two things. Firstly, staff were working slower than we expected, and secondly, they worked for fewer hours than we expected. So hopefully that's made a bit of sense of your fixed overhead variances. As usual, you can see with variances, it's just a matter of practicing and learning the calculations. I've tried to use hopefully fairly clear performers here that you can learn and follow, but it's just a matter of practice, so jolly good luck with that.